For people signing on, we'll be starting in just a minute or two as everybody finishes logging on here. Okay, why don't we get started today? Thank you all for joining. I know there will be more people to join. My name is Bob Hummer. I'm now the past president of PAA. I was president in 2021, and I'm thrilled to be here today. This has been a special series of events of past president webinars that we've been holding over the last couple of years during the COVID pandemic. Big thanks to John Weeks and the History Committee for putting these on. I'll turn it over to John in just a minute. Before I do so today, again, thank you for joining us. We got two special past presidents to update us today. You know, these have been just wonderful events, and I'm looking forward to it myself. A couple of introductions. I want to introduce Marcy Carlson, who was the vice president of PA in 2021 with me, and we had so much fun together with PA, and just a ton of respect, and we just loved working together on PA last year. So Marcy will help with running the program today. And then I also want to introduce to you the new PA president and vice president, respectively, Sonal Desai, the new president of PA from the University of Maryland. They're waving, and Jenny Van Hook at Penn State University, the new vice president of PAA. So it's wonderful to have you both signed on with us. PA is in great hands. We're looking forward to a fabulous meeting later this spring. And again, thank you for joining us. At this point in time, I'll turn it over to John Weeks. I mean, he and the History Committee have developed this set of webinars. Marcy and I have simply supported them, and added our 2 cents when the time was right. But John and the History Committee deserve all the credit for organizing these events and doing such a wonderful job with them. So I'll turn it over to John. He'll explain what we're going to be doing today. The one thing I'd ask is that for our audience members, please post questions in the Q&A button along the way. We have folks who will be looking at those, saving those, asking those after the presentations. So if you have the questions, put them in there, and the History Committee will do their very best to get to those after the presentations. Okay, so John Weeks, Chair of the History Committee. Thank you, John.
Okay, thank you very much, Bob, for that introduction. Now, actually, Marcy was going to introduce the committee members. Marcy, are you there? Do you want to do that, and then we'll move on to because that kind of follows directly from what Bob was just saying about putting the questions in and the History Committee members vetting those questions for discussion at the end of our panelist presentations.
Sure, John, happy to do so. And thank you very much to you and the entire committee for organizing these great events. So in addition to John, who you've already met, we have Dennis Hodgson, who's an emeritus professor of sociology at Fairfield University. We also have Karen Hardy, who is the president and CEO of What Works Association and Hardy Associates. And we have Wynn Brown, senior program officer of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So huge gratitude for the work that you all do as a committee and really keeping track of PAA's history, documenting it, putting on wonderful events like this. So a lot of gratitude from me and Bob both. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Marcy. So just to remind everyone of the agenda, we're going to have two presentations today from past PAA presidents. We had hoped to have three, but unfortunately, Dr. Alberto Poloni is not able to join us for health reasons today. He will be on the next panel. He's already agreed to be on the next panel, so we won't miss him down the road. But we will start with Dr. Marta Tienda. We'll go to Dr. Kathleen Harris, and then following their two presentations, we will have two PhD students, Jules Gonzalez and Leif Ye, who will discuss respectively Dr. Tienda and Dr. Harris's talks, and then we will be opening things up to the public, and that is where the History Committee members will help decide questions and feed them off to you folks to get answers for them. So let's get right into that. Our first panelist is Dr. Marta Tienda, who is the Maurice P. During 22 Professor in Demographic Studies and Professor of Sociology and Public Affairs at Princeton University. She was PAA president in 2002, a few years after moving to Princeton from the University of Chicago. So, Marta, take it away for us.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen before I get all caught up here. Can you see it? All right, are we ready? Yes.
We're ready.
Good. Well, thank you very much. And I want to join the chorus in thanking the History Committee for its work in organizing this event and many like it. In addition to the presidential interviews, I think that this is another way to record our history, and it's been a labor of love for all of you, but especially John, you've been at whatever event recording our history, you've been there. So your leadership is exemplary and will serve our organization in the years to come. I'd like to begin by saluting two giants in our field that we've lost in the current year. I would not be here today were it not for Harley Browning, who has been an exemplary and selfless mentor and recruited me to sociology. He passed away in June at the age of 94. I was a literature major, and he decided that I should become a sociologist when I took a class with him. And he sponsored my transfer from the literature department at UT to sociology. And I had never taken a soc class, econ or stats class, or heard of demography as a formal field. And he took a huge risk, and I'm very grateful to him. But in addition, I want to mourn the loss of my dear friend, former past president, Sarah McClanahan. We go back a very long time, over 50 years at UT, then Wisconsin, and finally at Princeton. Sarah has left an indelible imprint on the PAA. There are sessions on child well-being now at every PAA session because of her presence. And what's more, she trained a platoon of highly productive graduate students who will continue to build on her legacy and her illustrious career. They will both be, they'll both be missed. I'd like to now begin to talk about my PAA presentation address in 2002, which is about 20 years ago. And it was demography and the social contract. And this is not something I had worked on before I started some research. And it's really more generally about the civic implications of demographic trends. And I highlighted these through the prism of immigration and attendant population diversification, two themes that I have researched, but I questioned whether and how membership is qualified as heterogeneity increases. The diversity theme invoked some of Rousseau's ideas about heterogeneity and the need for inclusion and equity to avoid sectarian or partisan divisions, hence the title, The Social Contract. In the address, I examined some historical debates about membership through the prism of immigration, and specifically focused on apportionment and non-citizen voting. My address compared two periods of very high immigration at the turn of the 20th century and then at the end of the 20th century. Both were periods where the foreign-born share of the U.S. population was very high. But my 20-year retrospective or reflection will focus on the growing tensions over apportionment and representations since 2000. Apportionment, as we all know, is mandated by the U.S. Constitution. And I built this slide to emphasize a couple of points that it is based on population, which is why we do a census, and they're counting the whole number of persons in each state. And that's a really important phrase, persons in each state, excluding Indians not taxed, because the word persons has become very controversial. And the Census Act of 1790 established usual place of usual residence as the basis for all enumerations, and always included non-citizens whose usual place of residence was the United States in the enumeration. But yet, then at the end of the 20th century, and now the question remains about who should be included for purposes of apportionment. But why did I get on this topic in the first place? I started to think about what it was that triggered my interest. And most of my work prior to this, writing the address, was focused on immigration, on employment and earnings, program participation, education differentials, and the like, mostly micro-level analysis. But my focus on the civic implications of demographic trends reflects both coincidence, serendipity, and curiosity. I stumbled on a graph of it illustrated here, one of the curve for Illinois, I knew a traditional immigrant state. I had just left the state, and it showed the declining share of representatives for the state over the 20th century. So I wondered whether the same thing was happening in New York, another immigrant state, and indeed it was, but not Texas, Florida, or California. So that triggered my interest in why is this happening? To what extent has immigration contributed to the reallocation of seats in the House? It was just that simple. My interest in non-citizen voting was equally serendipitous. It was a topic of conversation at a Robert Wood Johnson conference at a totally different topic. And I was stunned to learn that non-immigrants could vote in federal elections. Was that true? How long did it exist? When was it stopped? So I started investigating and learning along the way. So voila, the PAA address. But for I'll focus mostly on immigration and apportionment today, but I will make a couple of comments about non-citizen voting because it's become one of the top controversial issues in recent years. So my address noted that the foreign-born population has been a focus of apportionment debate since the turn of the century. And even though the Constitution is clear about who should be counted, the debates have always questioned the language in the Constitution, the interpretation of the word persons, what kind of persons, American persons, who's an American person, only the US born, only immigrants, citizens. So at issue was the terms of membership and the conceptions of citizenship, which is what I used to frame the discussion, drawing on some of the political science literature that I had not read until I was preparing this. And I won't belabor my findings because they're a matter of public record, but instead call attention to several updates. So I did some counterfactuals. How would the apportionment have taken place if we only focus on natives, or if we stopped immigration and only counted established immigrants or only citizens? Debates that are currently taking place today. But shortly after the address was published, Dudley Poston and a grad student published a paper in Social Science Quarterly in 2004, where they looked at the 2000 census only and looked at what would happen if we eliminated undocumented immigrants and the like. So they've done several additional counterfactuals. And there have been many more since then, 2003, 19. The 19 analysis was a projection of what would happen if we exclude non-citizens or the foreign-born or the undocumented, and what would happen if we added Washington, D.C. became a state. So all these issues about representation have been addressed by others, and I'm delighted to see that happen. So basically, the address compared early and late immigrant century and apportionment debates. There were some similarities, like diversity and population heterogeneity was common at both times. But what has changed is that at the turn of the century, immigrants were residentially concentrated. Today, they're in the latter part of the 20th century, they were more residentially dispersed. Rural-urban divisions were common in both and concerning for both times. Undocumented immigration only was relevant to the latter part of the 20th century, and debates in Congress in both times, but followed up in the late 20th century by lawsuits and the like. But this hasn't stopped. In 2017, even though there was a lawsuit and the Supreme Court ruled in 1980 that all persons are to be counted, in 2017, Representative King from Iowa proposed a joint resolution to amend the U.S. Constitution to persons in each state who are citizens of the United States for purposes of apportionment. So these issues have continued, and they become very vitriolic in recent days. The Congressional Research Service showed that King's approach would benefit states with small immigrant populations like Iowa, and disadvantaged states with large foreign-born populations like California, New York, but also Texas. So what's new? There have been developments since 2000 that I would like to highlight today in today's discussion. Now, this is a familiar graph. We've all seen it. But I presented to illustrate what happened since my address, which focused on the two high points when immigration was on the high point, as all-time high up to that point. It continued to rise. The foreign-born share since 2000 rose more slowly in the decade than in the 2 decades that I analyzed, only 3 percentage points between 2000 and 2010, and has been relatively flat since that time. And what's more, recent estimates suggest that the percent foreign-born has actually declined a bit to 13.2%. I was a little surprised by that. There's some skeptics out there, so I did a little bit more checking. And sure enough, the Census Bureau recent release shows that, in fact, the net immigration, the U.S. foreign-born population, is declining for several reasons. So net international migration peaked in 2016, but then has begun to fall for between 16 and 19, owing to 3 trends. And that's before the COVID. Declining immigration, admissions slowed considerably during the prior administration. It took a little while for that to actually kick in. So we see it showing up after 18, 19. Increasing emigration of the foreign-born as hostility toward immigrants rises. And then since 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic, which was providing additional cover for restricting entries at the southern border, and it coincided with the restriction of entries of other groups. So the scenario about immigration is changing, but that won't necessarily change the narratives that we're hearing in the political discourse. It's important to have the facts. There have been another development since 2000, and that is, yes, our population has grown, albeit a bit more slowly, especially in the last decade. But there are some major developments here for apportionment since the year 2000. Importantly, 4 of the top traditional immigration states have lost seats since 2000. New York lost 3, one this year by about 100 residents. Think about that. And with all the, I'll talk about this, about the census and the citizenship question, plus the intensity of COVID, precisely when the census was underway, 100 seats is really a painful loss. New Jersey lost 1 over this 20-year period. California finally lost 1 recently, and Illinois lost 2, 1 in each decade. But the great big news is Florida and Texas. They won. They're the big winners. Texas has gained 6 seats since 2000, 2 between 2010 and the most recent census, and 4 between 2000 and 2010. Florida gained 3 seats since the year 2000. So both states have taken very strong anti-immigrant stances, especially Texas. And at least in the governor's race so far that's already been launched, Texas will make immigration a top political issue and border security. So there's more coming. Immigration and apportionment in the 21st century. I'm deeply concerned, more concerned since I started looking at data for this presentation and think about what the implications are, the civic implications going forward in our highly partisan and divided country. And their population shifts have continued to the unwelcoming states, as we've seen. Heightened enforcement during Obama administration and restrictions during Trump kept immigration on the national agenda, so that and anything goes as facts, not the real ones. Obama naively assumed that internal enforcement and deportation would symbolize rule of law and lead to comprehensive reform, but he was wrong. In the Trump administration, border enforcement, symbolized by this infamous wall, took on center stage. And it makes for great theater, but immigration from Mexico had actually fallen since 2008. So it was not even an issue, but they made it an issue, and it became problematic as more Central South Americans arrived at the southern border. So it fed the news feeds and fuels the narrative that we lost control of our borders. So there's been this kind of returning rhetoric of blaming the immigrants. Political polarization has intensified. I could not imagine in 2000 that we would be where we are politically with the depth of polarization that has unfolded since, especially since Obama was elected, because that was a turning point. We thought it was, for some, it was a post-racial society. For others, it's what's he doing in the White House and everything else in between. So my 20-year reflection focused on 5 points that have very high stakes for apportionment in the current round. And these are the growth in the population representative ratio, the allegations continued again of non-citizen voting, the dilution of the Voting Rights Act, it's also very population-based, the politicization of the census and the citizenship question and what implications that has had, which we are only beginning now to understand, and the intensified gerrymandering, single party systems versus independent commissions that are going to do gerrymandering. And it's important to point out that for even though the Constitution is clear about all people being counted for the apportionment, for redistricting, that is not the case. Every state can decide what criteria, who it will count for the purposes of drawing congressional districts. So that's another danger sign. So on the first point, Congress and the population per representation ratio. The U.S. House of Representatives has been fixed at 435 since 1910. And during that period, you can see that the representation ratio has more than tripled from 1 for every 200,000 to 1 representative for 761,000. It's higher than any OECD country. And it's reasonable to ask how an increasingly diverse population we can represent it in the same way with the same number of representatives in the U.S. House. These major changes in composition and distribution. Well, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences has a solution, and they did this well before the 2020 census. They made a case for enlarging the House of Representatives. It's a bipartisan commission that wrote the first report that went into the final report, and it's actually one of the top level recommendations to enlarge the House of Representatives and the Electoral College and make both more representative of the nation's population. I wish I could be more sanguine about the prospects of that happening, but unfortunately, if proposed by the current administration, it's dead in the water. The second is the continued allegations of non-citizen voting. The Brennan Center used state prosecution records to conclude that it's a very, very infinitesimal number of cases of non-citizen voting, sometimes by mistake that people don't understand that LPR does not allow you to vote. Yet you see, there are all these narratives, and I've just put a couple of them because they're pretty hard to stomach, that make continued allegations in this type of social media that's proliferating, making claims that illegal votes affected the outcome. And today, it is possible for municipalities to allow non-citizens to vote, but very few of them do it. In the whole country, only 15 municipalities allow non-citizens to vote. And only 2 state constitutions even mention non-citizen voting, Arizona and North Dakota, and they say you can't vote in this state. So period, that's end of story. There may be more of these coming forward, I don't know. But what worries me about these allegations is they offer a convenient fiction to claim flawed and make voting difficult and challenge the outcomes in future elections. The third issue that concerns me is the dilution of the Voting Rights Act that protected minority voters, specifically Section 5 and Section 2. Both were weakened by Supreme Court decisions in 2013 and 2019, respectively. The courts in Section 5 ruled that the formulas used to determine what parts of the county qualified was out of date. Because the formulas were all, the population had changed so much. And so it says Congress needs a new law in order to reinstate that portion of the Voting Rights Act. And the problem though today that map drawers have access to much more sophisticated and powerful mapping tools and granular data about voting behavior. So, who's going to win on this one, assuming it did go back to Congress, which is unlikely right now, is a problem. And the second one has to do with the VRA Section 2. That one doesn't expire, but it's focused on gerrymandering and the creation of these favorable districts. Well, we know that the Latino and the Asian population is not as residentially segregated as the African-American population was. So when the Voting Rights Act Section 2 was crafted, and it may not apply, and they cannot meet that criterion today. So the states then can decide. The court did say, oh, this is terrible. It's harmful, but it's outside of our jurisdiction. So they recognize that it's pernicious. But who gets counted for purposes of redistricting? Unlike apportionment, which is in the Constitution, it's possible for states to decide what criteria they're going to use, what demographic criteria. And that to me is a very serious consideration. Fourth, Census 2020. I know I'm running out of time. I'll stop. We all know about the new methods. I think it's remarkable that an estimate of the undercount is relatively low on the aggregate, but with all the challenges of COVID and going online, and then the challenges with the citizen question and unprecedented political meddling in the count. There are differential undercounts. Texas is one of them. They did not try to recruit people to answer the census, but when you see that households with non-citizens in them had a 3.4% undercount, it leads you to question of some of these states that got a seat or lost a seat, especially those on the margin. And the final point that worries me about apportionment has to do with the redistricting and is designed for unprecedented gerrymandering. Most of the states, all the states in pink are controlled by Republican legislatures, those in blue, single Democratic legislatures. So they're all going to try to gerrymander around their own interests. And only the yellow and gray do not, either they have bipartisan commissions or they only have one at-large representative. So what worries me about this is that there will be an unprecedented move to solidify partisan advantages in the next round of apportionment in the redistricting. And focusing on my current state of residence, this example makes me very anxious because Texas gained 6 seats and 2 more in the last round. It's super ripe for partisan gerrymandering with the dilution of the Voting Rights Act, and it seems destined to consolidate GOP control. And there are discussions in the state now about whether we should count only citizens, voters, legal residents for drawing these new maps. So more to follow, but it's very concerning. And you can see how, if you compare the 2010 map with the 2020 map, that there is already very clear effort to dilute the vote. So I'll conclude by raising some questions. I don't have any answers about internal migration and where it's going to go in the future, because living in a high growth state where you can almost feel it daily, there may be further in interim votes, midterm elections, some change, but there's been a big pushback in trying to disenfranchise many populations. Congress, whether it'll act on the increase the size of the House, I can only wish, but I doubt it. Will partisan gerrymandering cement or deepen partisan divisions? I worry about that. I think that's the case, but we need to keep a watch on it. And then will immigration become a wedge issue in 2022 and beyond, as it was in the past? So we have, I talked about, concluding my address in 2002, about the importance of aligning demography with democracy. We've pulled away from that goal, and I would call us to reverse course of where we're going and to realign democracy with demography. Thank you.
Well, Marta, thank you very, very much for that disturbing presentation. I mean, I agree with you that your talk has a lot of modern, everyday today ramifications. Indeed, I feel I can see my health and well-being being undermined, which takes us directly to our next panelist, our second panelist here, Dr. Kathleen Harris, who is the James E. Haar Distinguished Professor of Sociology at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She was PAA president in 2009. Then, as now, and for all of her academic career, she was at Chapel Hill. So, Kathy, where do we go from here?
Let me bring up my slides. Here we go. Okay. Oops, sorry, okay. I've got so many windows open, I can't find the right thing here. There we go.
There we go.
Okay. All right, sorry. All right, are you still seeing my slides?
we can see the slide show, but it's not the presentation mode.
All right, sorry for the delay in this. Hold on. Oh, now are you able to see the presentation mode?
I think actually now we see what you see, but that's,
Okay.
if you slide over to slideshow, that should see that over kind of in the middle of the top.
There. Is that help? Is that help? No.
Scoot your cursor over from home to over to slideshow and click on that, and that should get us where we want. See what I'm talking about? And go up to the top.
Right here?
Up one more line up to the very top. Yeah, there. Slide over to the right to slideshow. A little more to the right.
See, the problem is this. Okay, got it. I couldn't move the.
There we go. There we go. Yeah. Click that.
Okay. Is it working?
Well, it didn't actually work. It didn't quite work like it's supposed to. Not sure why.
I'm not sure why either. Let me try again. And
Okay.
sorry, I apologize. All right, let's try this again. It's weird because it's coming up here.
So Kathy, you see the top of the presenter view. If you click the display settings and switch it like you did earlier in the practice, I think that will probably help.
I don't know why okay. All right, let me try this one more time. All right, is it coming up? No?
We see your the screen of PowerPoint.
Okay, thank you. Let me put this here.
Mhm.
And I'll switch the display settings. All right. Do we have it?
There we go.
All right, thank you.
Perfect.
All right. Okay, so let me start in the very beginning. Thanks everybody for your patience. Thanks, John, and thanks to the History Committee for organizing this webinar series and inviting me today. Thanks to the past presidents and vice presidents and current presidents for their support in this. So as you can see, the title of my talk back in 2009 was an integrative approach to health. What I thought I would do today is review the population research context at the time of my talk, the main points of the address, and then assess what happened to the topic and what we have learned with an integrative design and approach over the last 10 years and where we're going in the future. So, now I have to say, I've never had this trouble before, but I can't advance the slides. Okay, got it. Guess I'll have to click on it. Okay. So in the 2000s, there was growing interest in the topic of health within the population science community. And I sort of detail this in my address. There was more data on health as many longitudinal studies began to gather health data, and funding increased across the biomedical institutes, but also the institutes and the foundations that funded social and behavioral research, so NICHD and NIA. And there was a broadening of the definition of health beyond the presence or absence of illness. WHO, for example, argued to consider health in the broader context of its contribution to social development and expanded the definition to include the ability to lead a socially and economically productive life. There was increasing focus on health disparities at the time, probably attributed to President Clinton's initiative on race, where he increased federal funding to eliminate disparities by race and ethnicity by 2010. And of course, as demographers, we've long studied disparities from the beginning of our discipline in terms of mortality differentials. And then the aging of the industrialized population, I mean, with aging naturally brings attention to chronic illness and mortality and morbidity, sorry. So today, I mean, even in pre-COVID, health is really central to all aspects of life. Health knowledge has increased, healthy diets, behavior, sleep, medications. We have a much more educated, a much more health educated public. But in the early 2000s, health was really more in the arena of aging scholarship with a focus on morbidity and mortality. And even in aging data sets, health was self-reported. Okay, so, okay, somehow I am going for, oh, it's working. Okay, so the most research then on health at the time focused on the early and later ages of the life course. So I was really trying to make the case, and my first point for the importance of studying health among young people during adolescence and early adulthood. I argued that health during adolescence and early adulthood set trajectories into adulthood, trajectories of health into adulthood, and health during adolescence and early adulthood was often a marker of social stratification. I also described profound social, cultural, and epidemiologic changes that had occurred in these life stages, in particular, the age at which young people were settling into more institutional adult roles of worker, spouse, parent was moving up the age spectrum, known as the lengthening of the transition from adolescence to adulthood. And this meant that there was a more engagement in the lifestyle of that period. And at the same time, the age at which disease onset occurred was moving down the age spectrum. There were increases in diabetes and hypertension among younger and younger adults. So, given these 2 points, the importance of studying health among the young and the changing context of these life stages and their implications for health, I advocated for using an integrative approach to the study of health among the young that bridged biomedical sciences with social and behavioral sciences. The biomedical sciences, I felt at the time, were starting to recognize the importance of social factors, but they really didn't have the data. They really didn't have the social data. In fact, I attended meetings at the time when they described the environment as measured by parents' education. And social and behavioral sciences had few objective measures of health. They were mainly self-reported, as I said, or those that they were studying, mainly aging populations. So these were my observations, at the time when I was developing the design for AdHealth in its 4th wave in the early 2000s. And there were other sort of background issues that influenced me at the time. AdHealth was and is a trans NIH study. Whenever we developed new waves, we would meet with our co-funding NIH institutes and foundations, and that time describe the design of AdHealth, how great it was, it's nationally representative. Investigators and researchers in your institute will really enjoy using the data. And then when they asked me what my health measures were, I reported that they were primarily a measure of self-rated health, self-reports of asthma, and other doctor-diagnosed chronic illnesses. And these investigators just laughed at me. They scoffed at these measures and said, well, how will people know? So originally I was really kind of insulted by this. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that they were right. For a health study, these really were very poor measures, and we were missing a lot. So while the biomedical and epidemiologic studies did not really understand nationally representative designs and their value or have much social data, they did have the health measures that we needed. And so sorry about this. And so to get objective measures of health, I realized that I needed to engage a biomedical investigator to work with me in this design. And that's the other part of the story. I had a hard time convincing a biomedical scientist that social factors were important in health. And it took me about a year to line up the investigators that I needed. And so that's behind one of my main goals in integrating biological data into social and behavioral models of health, was to elevate and highlight the importance of social factors in health. If we measure the biomedical predictors and outcomes appropriately, then we could convince them of the importance of social factors. So now that was the context in early 2000, but needless to say, things have changed. Okay. So the integrative approach that I described in my talk said that we need to examine the linkages in social, behavioral, and psychological and biological factors to understand health, that the integration should occur at multiple levels of influence, the macro, community, and individual, that integration should occur in all steps of the research process: theory, design, data collection, and analysis. We shouldn't just collect biological data because we can. And that integration should focus on young adult life to identify the origins of health disparities and to map pre-disease pathways. And so, given that an integrative approach was more sort of theoretical or conceptual at the time, but I do want to sort of acknowledge that my development of the integrative approach was highly influenced by Bert Singer and Carol Riff, who co-edited a National Academy report called New Horizons in Health that came out in 2001. But even at this point, it was mainly conceptual. So in my address, I then used AdHealth to sort of illustrate how to apply an integrative approach, and in particular what the benefits of using this approach would be for studying health among young people. So I described the theoretical concepts, data measures, and social, psychological, behavior, and biological domains. I illustrated how their linkages provide the full picture of health and development across the life course. I focused on biology because of its critical role in health. And then, among the benefits, I showed how much poor health we actually miss using self-reports. So, for example, among young people in their late 20s, we discovered that 25% had hypertension, which is an amazing finding of its own. But among the 25%, only 1/4 knew that they had hypertension. 3/4 did not know. They were not reporting that they were aware of that. I showed how health worsens when young people transition into young adulthood, and this sets health trajectories into adulthood. In particular, as adolescents age in their early and mid-20s, they are less likely to eat breakfast. They are more likely to eat fast food, exercise less, become obese, have no health insurance, are more likely to not get regular physical checkups, dental checkups, or healthcare when needed, are more likely to have asthma, STDs, smoke cigarettes, use marijuana, use hard drugs, and binge drink. So this is a very vulnerable period for health in the life course. And the levels of poor health increase, and then they typically remain throughout adulthood. And finally, I showed how early life obesity is a marker for social stratification in young adulthood. In particular, those who are obese in adolescence are less likely to attend college, finish college, get married, or own a home by their late 20s and have less household income, personal income, or fewer assets than those who are not obese in adolescence. Okay, so where is this topic today? So integrative research is widely used in most health research within population sciences. Happy to say, there's been just an explosion of biological data in existing and new social and demographic studies. I'm glad to take credit, but as Marta mentioned, the serendipity is always involved. I was really just one of the pioneers who was able to sort of exploit new non-invasive technologies for collecting biospecimens in a national field setting. There were, many others, Duncan Thomas, Elizabeth Frankenberg working in Indonesia and Mexico, Noreen Goldman, Costa Rica. But again, those were more aging studies, and people wondered, why would you bother to collect these measures among young people? And that was the case I was trying to make. These new technologies just exploded in the 2000s and 2010. Tom McDade has a 2007 demography article, What a Drop Can Do, Dried Blood Spots as a minimally invasive method for integrating biomarkers into population-based research. Blood spots, in earlier ways of health, we made our own kits to collect DNA. Now there's just commercial origin kits, and you can send them to people and they can self-collect. Same with blood spots. Last year, Tasso developed a blood collection for venous blood that is non-invasive, and you can't even feel it, no pain, just put it in your arm. So that's been a huge factor. And I want to now take an opportunity to quote what PAA President Eileen Crimmins said during her presidential address about the integration of biological data. So let me see if this will work. I've got her real words from the presidential address, but since technology is failing me today, we'll see.
Kathleen Harris, in her presidential address 10 years ago, argued for an integrated biological, psychological, and social approach to health. The progress made in integrating biological with social data in large population studies is absolutely remarkable, and I think beyond what even she could have envisioned then.
I couldn't say it better myself. Remarkable. All right, so now what I'd like to do is just sort of give you some examples of what we've learned with an integrated approach to health among young people since my talk. And I'll cover these areas. I'm going to go kind of quickly. So in terms of theoretical contributions, this was the original integrative life course framework that we actually developed in early 2000s in AdHealth. AdHealth is a multidisciplinary investigative team. So, we had people sitting around the table who were geneticists, cardiologists, sociologists, epidemiologists, survey methodologists, psychologists, economists, and we had to come up with a conceptual framework that all of their research was going to fit into, and this is what it was. So you can see that it's showing linkages between context, behavior, and biology, and they interact and have feedback loops with health and well-being across the life course. And all of the subject PI, all of the sub-project PIs, were able to sort of customize what they were studying in terms of genetics or social mobility, romantic relationships, obesity, family formation within this framework. Now, there's been other conceptual approaches that have built on this, which was rather crude. Here's one that has a focus primarily on social determinants of health, and this is emphasizing the multi-level aspect of pre-disease pathways, arguing that the causes of disease, morbidity, and mortality operate through multiple levels, from sort of upstream, macro level, structural policies, technology, culture, inequality, through midstream, community level structures like family, social networks, and physical and social environments to the proximate individual level causes. Again, this is focused more on the social, but the biology and the genes fall within the individual and proximate causes. And of course, these factors operate both within and across life stages. And then here is this is a more recent incarnation of a biosocial conceptual framework that my colleague Tom McDade and I developed. And this also emphasizes the multi-level aspects of social context in the top panels that operate on the individual outside the body, and the biological domains that operate inside the body in the bottom panels in response to environmental influences across the life course. So as I described before, one of my motivations really for integrating biology in our social behavioral models of health was to elevate the importance of social factors. So this remains my goal today, although I have to say that COVID probably did much more along these lines to highlight the importance of social factors than anything that we've done. So here is a study by Yang and colleagues that examined how social integration or social embeddedness in social networks is related to health and longevity through biological mechanisms that link social relationships with disease and longevity. So we have a lot of evidence about path A. We've got a lot of evidence on path B, but we really did not know much about path C, and especially among young people. We did know that social relationships, social integration, social isolation is very important for older adults. But what we were interested in is how this worked across the lifespan. So we use 4 perspective studies here to look at this path C. And here are the findings. So physiological regulation is measured in 3 biological systems: inflammatory, measured by CRP, cardiovascular with blood pressure, and metabolic with waist and body mass index. And we just so you can read this, the social integration during adolescence is the pink line, and how it's associated with these biological health outcomes 15 years later. The social integration in young adulthood is the green line, and how it's related to these outcomes. And then the blue line comes from HRS, and this is among older adults. We don't have the middle adults because they were not important in middle adulthood. But basically what you can see is as integration, which is on the horizontal scale, increases, you see lower values of CRP, blood pressure, waist circumference, and BMI. The levels, of course, are higher for older adults. But the thing to notice here is that the slopes for adolescents are much steeper for waist circumference and BMI. Now, as I said, that this finding wasn't new for older adults. It's also found in many animal studies, but it was new for young adults. The social integration is just as important in adolescents as it is for older people. This means we can intervene, we can create school policies to reduce social isolation among adolescents. Parents, physicians should be asking their patients in a regular checkup, how often they see their friends, what do they do socially. Here, I want to give an example of the role of health in social stratification pathways. We know that, of course, SES affects health through social causation, and that health selection, so there's a large literature on health as a marker of social stratification. And so here is a model by a talented young scholar, Jen Kane, who led this research and used all the longitudinal data and had health to kind of sort out these pathways. Health is here as a factor of social stratification in terms of selection, and that operates simultaneously with social causation, determining health. And we wanted to figure out when in the life course these pathways became set, when, and how they ultimately predict metabolic syndrome, which is a marker for cardiovascular disease. And so here's the findings. I mean, I think probably the main finding is that she was actually able to estimate this model. But what I really would just want to point out here are, these two pathways, and when health is important and when human capital development is important in relation to health in adulthood. So we see that the role of health is most critical from early adulthood into adulthood. So not so much adolescence to young adulthood, but the 20s, the years of the 20s. The effect size is twice as large on metabolic syndrome during the decade of the 20s. And while the role of human capital is especially important in adolescence, again, the effect size is much larger in the pathway between adolescence and early adulthood. And this is probably differentiating when young people go to college versus not. And so the origins of health disparities. There's substantial research showing that Blacks and other minorities at the same level of socioeconomic status, income, or education have worse health than whites. And this is typically observed in older ages. So why do we observe these racial and ethnic gaps in health at equal levels of SES at older ages? An answer might come from what happens earlier in the life course when racial and ethnic minorities are actually attaining these levels of SES. So you might ask the question, when young people come from disadvantaged backgrounds and move up the social ladder to improve their socioeconomic status, does their health benefit? And here's what we see, the study led by Gaydash, that among whites, those who achieve college or more, so that's the dashed line, they have lower metabolic syndrome than those with no degree. And that's true for both advantaged as well as disadvantaged backgrounds. And so disadvantage is on the horizontal scale. But for Blacks and Hispanics, when those from disadvantaged backgrounds complete college, they actually experience a higher probability of metabolic syndrome. So the dashed line crosses over and exceeds the line for no college degree. This is a surprising finding that there may actually be health deficits to upward mobility for Blacks and Hispanics. So if they take this sort of health hit earlier in the life course, that might explain why we see these differentials at older ages. Of course, the question for research now is why. We need to understand how the process by which racial and ethnic minorities achieve socioeconomic status differs. And I'm sure that people have many ideas of these mechanisms and are ready to study them. I'm going to end with an example of social genetic effects. The social genetic effects, there's substantial evidence actually in animal models that these exist, and more recently in human models. And it can be described as when there's an association between the genotypes or the genes of one individual and the phenotype or the behavior or characteristic of another. So it's this notion that the genes of one's social relations, their friends or classmates or grade mates, influence your health and behavior. And here's what was found. So you see this is the effect of a schoolmate and friends polygenic score for each of these outcomes, which is education, BMI, and height. Net of one's own polygenic score for each of these outcomes. And polygenic score you can think of as just a genetic propensity. The blue bar shows the genetic effects of schoolmates and then friends, and that's controlling for one's own genes on years of education, BMI, and height. And so you see that, the red bar is just sort of the baseline, the red dashed bar is the baseline effect of own genes on the outcome. And then the gray and blue bars attenuate from the red line with controls. And the final model then adds in the school and friend PGS. And so basically what you see here is that something seems quite believable that for the outcomes that involve many social processes and interactions, in particular education, including shared context, that the genes of one's schoolmates and the genes of one's friends have an important association with one's own education, over and above one's own genes for education. Much less influence, however, for BMI and height. Understandable. Okay. So let me sum up. What have we learned then with an integrative approach to health among young people? Studying these biological mechanisms underlying health among young people enables us to identify when disparities first emerge in the life course, explain why they emerge, identify the life stages when social and biological factors are most important in pre-disease pathways, identify health risks before biological damage and disease are manifest. And all of that will allow us to intervene then to improve population health and the health of population subgroups. Now, what's the future hold for us? And here again, I'm going to quote Eileen Crimmins in her address. We have made considerable progress in clarifying multi-system components of physiological change, and we are now integrating the study of basic cellular and molecular mechanisms. That was the last example that I listed that encourage the progression of morbidity and disability and lead to mortality. So with new genomic data, we are able to define a biological age and then compare that age with chronological age to identify within the body accelerated aging, when biological cells, tissues, organs, and systems are aging at a faster rate than expected for one's chronological age. And emerging research is showing that socioeconomic disadvantage among adolescents and fragile families and young adults in ad health is associated with accelerated biological aging in these life stages. So getting at molecular and cellular changes that lead to disease among young people before symptoms are evident or disease is manifest is really a profound scientific advance of which we really are right on the cusp. So, and then at this point, I want to fondly relate a memory of the late Richard Sussman. When I was working to convince Richard the value of NIA co-funding and then fully funding Ad Health as an aging study, even when the cohort was in their late 20s, I would tease him and say, you can't begin to study aging at age 50. It begins much earlier. He, of course, agreed, but shot back at me, show me how you can study aging with Ad Health. And again, this is when the sample was in the 20s. But this challenge was really part of my motivation for expanding the integration of biology into the design of Ad Health. And I only wish that he were here to see how it worked out. But I think the future holds great promise for much more knowledge with an integrative approach. And I'll end there.
Okay, Kathy, thank you very, very much. There should be a big applause, of course, as there should have been after Marta's talk. I really appreciate that. There's a lot of stuff in there. And we have two PhD students who are going to lead the discussions here. Our first discussant, who will focus on Dr. Tienda's presentation, is Jules Gonzalez, who is a PhD student in demography at the University of Texas, San Antonio. Jules holds a BA in cultural anthropology from UT Pan American and an MA in poli-sci from UT San Antonio. So Jules, I want to go ahead and talk about Dr. Tienda's presentation.
Thank you, John, for the introduction. Professor, thank you for inviting me and the University of Texas at San Antonio to this panel. And thank you to the History Committee for organizing this event. Now, Professor, in your 2002 demography and social contract paper, you indicated that the minority groups would increase in the US population by the year 2020. Time has proven you correct. Based on the 2020 census data, Texas gained the most residents of any state since 2010. In fact, people of color make up 95% of the Texas population, while non-Hispanic whites amounted to only 5% growth since 2020. However, new political district maps do not reflect the updated demographic information. As a result, new political district maps place non-Hispanic white voters with a disproportionate control in elections, providing a disservice in aligning democracy with demography. For example, in the redrawing of the South Texas districts, new political district maps do not reflect the growth of the Latino border communities from the past decade. Now, this is important because the Texas-Mexico border region has experienced exponential development in industrialization, urbanization, and population growth. It is also the gateway to more than half of all US-Mexico trade. Yet, given this area's economic and population growth, the borderlands have been undercounted in the census. With that, I have 3 questions. Question 1, assuming the Build Back Better legislation passes and provides funds to districts as well as other type of current programs funded on block grants, would the new political district maps hinder the allocation of funds for border community infrastructure? And if so, what implications would this have for border residents, the state of Texas, and the nation in general? Question 2, if new political maps are kept the same pending various federal lawsuits, do you see a decrease or an increase in civic engagement by the people of color as they might feel discouraged by the new district maps? And lastly, question number 3, as a demographer, how do you propose addressing undercount errors in the US Census? Thank you.
Do you want me to speak or do you want the next person?
No, please go ahead and respond.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you. Very, very observant and interesting that you also focused on Texas, because it's not because we both live here, but there's a lot going on here. And we used to say what happens in California, so goes the nation. I think what's happening in Texas, other copycats are underway, are watching. So I think that's really important. Your focus on the border region is quite important because they also had a big surge in COVID at the time, but also have a large foreign-born population, non-citizen. And so this attempt to try to exclude, add the citizenship question could have had a disproportionate impact. The only solace I have there and on the litigation and the undercount is that our current census director, Robert Santos, God bless him, is so knowledgeable about the state of Texas. He was born and raised in San Antonio. He knows the Texas environment very well. He's a superb statistician, and he's not going to play monkey games. So right now, I think the Census Bureau experts are now being led by a very accomplished and understanding director. That said, that doesn't guarantee that politics won't continue to play its face. So yes, there's been an enormous amount of growth, and the border region is really important. And so, Governor Abbott understands that. That's why for whoever went to South Texas to announce that they were running for governor. I mean, what does that mean? So right there is already telling you, I am now going to protect our border, at least. So that was a very powerful symbolism. Also, the regained control of the borders is another powerful driver there. But it's very clear the Bureau has indicated that Texas, as one of the states, along with Mississippi, that there's a clear undercount. Dudley Poston has ranted about this because the state did very little to recruit participation in the census, like New York and other places. We saw how that worked out, but it could have been a lot worse if they hadn't. So yes, that's very clear. The question is whether, in order to get a recount, localities, municipalities have to appeal and go through a legal process. In the past, when this started, I was remembering Vince Baraba. I was a Census Advisory Committee member at the time, and there were the first round of litigation on the undercount. So initially, there were undercounts. When they do the final count, some of those things may be changed in after the post-enumeration survey. It will not affect apportionment. It might affect redistricting. I don't know. Oftentimes, those cases, they have a very high bar to be won. So it's a very expensive proposition for municipalities, particularly this time. What worries me even more, though, is who's going to be counted in those redistricting maps, and whether the general population, given the education level in those parts of the state, is relatively low. They're not so attuned to how they may be excluded from the redistricting process and their representation in political clout precisely because of the who's going to be counted for drawing the maps as opposed to who's counted for apportionment. And a lot of people don't understand or make that distinction. So the political maps may lead to litigation, but the standards for the voting rights, because of Section 2 being watered down so much, may not come to fruition, and that worries me. As a demographer, I say I'm really glad that Ren Farley and Lisa Nider are still on the case of post-enumeration surveys and analyzing those data. It'll take a while before they play out in some of the adjustments, but it's not going to affect any of the short-term political process. The block grants are really critical, though. So a lot of the funding, I don't know whether the Build Back Better will make it, but there are already existing many block grants that do need to be, that are population based. And that's why those counts are so critical. Texas stands to lose much money precisely because of the undercount of 1.3%. And that's the initial pass of the data. So Texas is a highly unequal state economically, socially, politically, and stay tuned. I wish I could had a crystal ball, and I'm not so sanguine about the voting, because based on Gerardo Cadava did a recent piece in the New York Times about the Latino vote. There is no such thing. It's a fiction. So it's a very diverse population, and people were surprised at how the Latinos in South Texas and other places voted in 2020. So to be continued, but it's not a guarantee that Latinos vote Democratic straight line, and that has been changing along with the demography and the economics of funding the state. So you're spot on, and that this could be one of your next papers or for your dissertation.
Jules, was there any other questions that you had, or did we want to move on? You okay?
No, she answered them greatly. Thank you.
Okay, very good. I should just say, I've been thinking while you've been talking, Marta, that one of the issues looking at your graphs about the population growth in Texas, of course, related to California, is that in California, we actually have net out migration. Internal domestic migration is out of California. We wouldn't be growing at all if it weren't for migrants from abroad. And part of that is because Texas has had a long policy of recruiting American businesses. I mean, businesses from California to go to Texas, where taxes are cheaper, housing is cheaper, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a big complex thing. I mean, think about the complexity of Kathy's model. There's a very complex model here as well. And thank you, Kathy. Let's move on to.
Well, can I just say that's why I raised the question in my semifinal slide about what's happening to population redistribution across states, because there's been writing about Texifornia. A lot of people from California are coming, and just watching the construction, you can feel the pulse in real time. Tesla, that is having streets named after it. Google is here. Everybody's here, and more are coming. Samsung is about to lodge a great big deal as well, and we're talking hundreds of thousands of people over a period of 10 years.
No, absolutely, that's right. Big stuff happening. Okay, so our second discussant, who will focus on Dr. Harris's presentation, is Alifia Ye, who's a PhD candidate in sociology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She holds a bachelor's degree in sociology and German from the University of Hong Kong, and a master's degree in sociology from Wisconsin. Alifia, go ahead.
Thank you so much, John. And thank you to everyone at PAA who worked really hard to organize this panel. I really enjoyed Dr. Kathy Harris's presidential address and her talk today, which nicely walked us through some of the most recent and exciting innovations in the field. In her presidential address, Dr. Harris invited us to take a new approach to the study of health, one that bridges together biomedical, social, and behavioral sciences. And as I actually only learned today, it was also an approach that took a lot of fighting and convincing to be where it is today. And it feels incredible to reflect now on just how many different types of data got collected in the decades since Dr. Harris's address. right? From blood pressure and pulse rate to the characteristics of one's romantic partners and friends, such as in the case of Ad Health, and all the exciting research opportunities that these data have presented to us. In her address, Dr. Harris also emphasized that an integrative approach involves more than just sticking biological measures in with social, psychological, and behavioral measures in our models, and more than just collecting data on things just because we can. Instead, it should inform our theory, research design, measurement, and analyses. Today, I think she gave us a lot of good examples by reflecting on the new research that has since then taken this approach and produced a lot of groundbreaking findings. So transitioning into some questions for you, Kathy. This one is a little bit more personal to me as a junior researcher, but maybe it'll be relevant to others too. I consider myself as someone who's been sitting at the doorstep of research that takes this integrative approach. I don't have a lot of training in biomedical sciences, so I often feel actually quite intimidated by the massive amount of information that we now have about people's biological outcomes and the huge diagrams that, you know, pack in dozens of pathways between bio and social outcomes. So I really appreciated when you talked about in your presidential address how there's a distinction between simply sticking measures in a model and thinking carefully about bringing together these multidisciplinary approaches, and not only in our models, but also in theories and research designs. So I was wondering if you have any advice for people like me who maybe want to make it our New Year's resolution to be more integrative in our approaches. What are some very doable first steps we can take to be more thoughtful when we build theories and statistical models that incorporate social science and biomedical knowledge? Or maybe rather on the flip side, what are some common mistakes that we should be avoiding? And I have another question, maybe I'll just post it now as well. This question emerged when I was rereading your presidential address. I really enjoyed the part where you looked back on the history of health disparity research. You actually briefly reviewed this in your talk, but I was actually kind of shocked to realize that back in 1998, when I was 4 years old, President Bill Clinton had already committed federal funds to eliminate racial and ethnic disparities in health by 2010. And that by the year 2000, all NIH institute had already developed programs for addressing these health disparities. But as we all know, racial disparities in health have mostly persisted in the time since then. And in April last year, which is over 2 decades later, CDC declared racism as a serious public health threat and made many new commitments to narrow racial disparities in health. You mentioned some of this in the talk already, but I was wondering, what do you think are some of the most important lessons we have learned in the last few decades regarding how to address racial disparities in health, especially based on research that took an integrative approach to health? And what are some new interventions we should probably be considering in order to truly improve the health of these different population subgroups? Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Leafia. Those are excellent questions and hard. How much time do I have? Not that much time to answer them all, but you know, in your first question, that's great. It's a great question. And you know, I think my recommendation would be to, you know, start simple. You know, when you're just beginning, if you're interested in health and you're looking, you know, whatever relationship, whatever the predictor is of health, I think the theory for why you think that predictor is really going to be important. Like, let's just say it's, you know, education on health, you know, what your theory tells you about the mechanisms by which education protects health or, you know, results in better health outcomes, that will, you know, point you to, you know, how that would work biologically. And so, I mean, you know, one way, and, you know, when we first started thinking about how to integrate biology among young adults, we thought, okay, well, what's going on with their health? You know, most people think young adults are pretty healthy. Well, because of the lengthening of the transition from adolescence to adulthood, there is a longer engagement in risk behavior, and that could involve drug use and so on. And so, we really tried to identify what were the health issues. The Ad Health cohort was also born at the onset of the obesity epidemic. So obesity is a big factor for this cohort. Thinking about socioeconomic status and health, one pathway by which it influences health is through stress pathways. If you have less education, you might be working at multiple jobs, you might have a long commute, you can't afford childcare. All of these sort of daily kinds of stressors will affect your health. And so, then you might think about, using a stress biomarker, a biological measure of stress. And there you can choose a measure of inflammation when you're stressed. Your stress management system is overworking and your cells become inflamed. Hypertension, blood pressure. I'm sure all of us have felt the effects of stress on our blood pressure. So that would be my response. Start simple. That's how I started. Very, very simple. And that's, using the theory to say, okay, well, what should I look at, rather than, oh my God, I can't figure this out. I mean, honestly, I can't figure it out. I just was reading, an abstract today where somebody was asking my advice, and I didn't know what biological measures they were talking about. So obviously I've got to read up on that. That would be my advice. And I really, think that that's the best. That makes the best research, not all the fancy measures, not tons and tons of measures, but just making those linkages very clear, both theoretically and analytically. I have to say that, I've been at, there's, geneticists, when we started, there is a lot of bad research out there that is done by social scientists that, use genetic research and they don't know what they're doing. But I have to say that, I've seen a lot of geneticists using social research when they don't know what they're doing and making just as many bad mistakes, like starting out with a sample of 20,000 and only ending up with, 700 because of missing data that they couldn't figure out, how to maintain. So, the integration is on both sides. The second question that you had, yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, that's amazing about the health disparities research. Back when we were thinking about health disparities, it would just seem like the thing to say, especially a demographer. We were always going to look at age, sex, and race differences and geographic differences. But the emphasis on it today is much, much, much stronger. And I think that it's because of, what we're seeing in terms of health, the huge disparities by education that seem to keep growing over time. For a while there was tremendous improvement in in the mortality levels of African Americans and Black Americans, and that has kind of stalled now for tons of reasons. So I think that, I think what's really important I think that, how do I say, the recognition that we're not getting at the root causes of racial and ethnic disparities by new funding and new data initiatives to try to understand some of these structural causes that define how racism, is systemic within our educational, criminal justice, legal systems, is the best, is the best lesson. I mean, the fact that, we haven't been able to explain or really understand these mechanisms for so long because maybe we just haven't had the data and haven't been looking in the right places, which is these more structural causes. So I really think that's the right direction to go in, especially to address racial and ethnic disparities. And there certainly is a lot of research going on right now trying to figure out, what the mechanisms that are operating in terms of the educational disparities in health. So that's, that that's my response. I mean, I think that we as a scientific community have responded in the right way by looking for, new data, creating new data, and, trying to understand, trying to incorporate these sort of multi-level models. So.
And Leafy, did you have any more questions, or did that cover your issues?
Yeah, that covered all of it. Thank you. Thank you, Kathy.
Very, very good. Thank you. Okay, so we have a few more minutes, and we've got at least some questions from the audience. The History Committee members, Wynn, Karen, Dennis, were you organizing those? What do we have out there?
So thanks, John. We're going to start with the second question. Marta, the two questions from the audience are both to you, and you've probably read the first one, which is quite long. So we'll let you think about that one while we ask a question from Terry Hull from his perspective in Australia, wondering for voter participation, would there be any chance of having compulsory voting, like Australia has compulsory voting, which is a holiday, and voting on Saturdays? Is that a possibility ever in the US?
Oh, don't I wish? Yes, we can. A person can hope. That's really important. In Mexico, before they're having presidential elections, you can't buy liquor the day before, the day of, or the day after the election. So think about that. It's a very serious proposition. You do get the time off to go vote, and they make a big deal out of it. You don't get fined. So whether that would work in this country, I don't think we have the apparatus ready to do that. But I think it's a really important question, especially now that voting itself, the franchise, which we assume is a part of citizenship, is under assault. That is, it's been restricted, the number of hours, the number of days. In Texas, I can hear in Austin, the people who have applied for ballots, for paper ballots, 50% of the applications have been denied. And the reason is that if the initial ID was on their Social Security and they put their driver's license, that didn't qualify. And if it was the opposite, that didn't qualify. So they are rejecting most of the applicants for paper ballots. So we're going backwards on this, and that's why I said we need to realign our mission of citizenship. That's the one. If we're so focused on citizens, and we know that citizens are the ones who are allowed to vote, why is it? It seems such a contradiction to actually be rescinding the opportunities and shrinking them. So we're going backwards, and I commend Australia, and I hope that we can follow your lead. Right now, we're in contested terrain. I did read the long question. It was too much to answer because I was trying to listen to Cassie's excellent presentation, and about inequality and the foreign-born population, and that we're losing ground in terms of the kinds of benefits. There were many of the attempts to rescind benefits for legal permanent residents were challenged in the courts. Some were stopped, some were narrowed, et cetera, some were overturned. So there has been some progress there. But my general answer is that demography is not destiny, that just because we have more foreign-born people does not mean that they're going to be incorporated. The National Academy of Sciences showed definitively that the U.S. is very successful at integration of immigrants, that the newest immigrants are integrating, despite the fact that we do not have integration programs and policies like Australia. That said, we continue to have a qualified acceptance of the foreign-born population, which in the address, I made a distinction between statutory participation and nominal participation. That is citizenship as membership and citizenship as participation. We are to the lowest common denominator of membership, but not participation. To the extent we continue to restrict the operation of immigrants to participate in American life and to get on a path to citizenship, we are falling behind. So to me, it represents a qualified acceptance. We lost a lot of ground in the last administration. I wish I could be more sanguine that we're going to be making up some ground going forward. But with immigration policy revision, comprehensive reform, just like not even on the table, when you have a very powerful symbol of border control, and then the refugees trying to cross, that sucks the air out of the possibilities of immigrant integration. And I hope that in my lifetime that we start making some realignment there. But your question falls within the broader frame of reference of rising inequality in this country. That is, we are all our young people, in Kathy's sample, are coming of age at a time of rising inequality, and that is a big challenge for understanding, another layer of all of these macro level policies, and it's affecting our communities of color terribly. We saw that everybody was happy to have their, some of my colleagues say, "Oh yeah, you don't in New York you can get anything delivered," and I said, "Well, you know who's delivering it." Right? It's all the immigrants on these bikes. Come snow, rain, whatever, you're going to get your food delivered or your things delivered. So we can't have it both ways. Either you participate and belong or you don't.
Thank you.
It is 3:30. So respect everyone's time. We unfortunately need to stop at this moment and move on with the rest of our days. I want to thank Marta and Kathy in particular for unbelievable presentations, turning back the clock back to their own addresses and then giving us the new perspectives that were so informative today. Jules and Leafia, wonderful. Thank you so much for your participation, for your great questions. I wish you the best at UTSA and Wisconsin, respectively. And John and the History Committee, again, thank you so much for organizing these. It's always been just fun to sit here and listen. This is like such a fun day to listen for all of us to these. I look forward to more of these past president addresses in the future. So with that, thank you all for attending. Thanks for coming today, and hope the rest of your day goes well.
Thank
you.
you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.